For centuries, entire civilizations prayed, healed, and connected with the divine through rituals that today are dismissed as black power. These ceremonies were not entertainment or superstition. They were the foundation of social order, medicine, and justice. What was once the heartbeat of African societies, systems of wisdom, healing, and harmony, was slowly rewritten into stories of fear and darkness. Yet these traditions were never about destruction. They were about balance, life, and connection to forces greater than the self. African spirituality was not a fringe practice reserved for a few. It was the thread that stitched communities together, guiding how families raised their children, how communities resolved conflicts, and how nations honored the cycles of the earth. It dictated how people treated one another, respected their elders, remembered their ancestors, and understood the natural world. These weren't mystical curiosities, but deeply rooted philosophies, refined over thousands of years, that gave entire civilizations their identity and strength. Somewhere along the line, this sacred legacy was branded as evil. Colonizers, missionaries, and media empires painted African traditions as savage, barbaric, and demonic. Spiritual leaders, once regarded as healers and counselors, were recast as witches and sorcerers. Shrines were torched, sacred drums silenced, and whole communities shamed into abandoning practices that had defined them for generations. What was once celebrated became feared. But this transformation didn't happen naturally. Demonization was a calculated weapon, aimed at severing people from the power of their own heritage. The question we must face is not if African spirituality was powerful. It clearly was, but why so much effort was invested in erasing it? What threatened empires and foreign religions so deeply that they needed to rename sacred rites as dangerous? The answer lies in the way spirituality binds people to their ancestors, to the land, and to each other. When you destroy someone's spiritual core, you weaken their memory, their unity, and their resistance. To colonize the body, one must first colonize the soul. This video will uncover how African spirituality journeyed from revered to reviled. We'll walk through the sacred foundations that once defined community life, trace the colonial campaigns that turned shrines into battlegrounds, explore how enslaved Africans carried traditions across oceans, and expose how Hollywood fueled the myth of black power as something to fear. By the end, you'll see how reclaiming these traditions isn't about returning to the past. It's about reclaiming truth, dignity, and self-knowledge. Because what was once dismissed as black power may in fact be one of the greatest untold sources of cultural resilience. And if we listen carefully, its echoes are not lost. They still shape the present and inspire the future. Before African spirituality was demonized, it thrived as the core of life itself. It was not a religion in the narrow sense, but a worldview, a way of understanding existence and humanity's place in it. It held that life was interconnected, the visible and the invisible, the living and the ancestors, the earth and the cosmos. This philosophy wasn't confined to temples or rituals. It infused politics, law, agriculture, medicine, and art. To be African was to live spiritually, and spirituality was woven into every breath of daily life. At the heart of this system was reverence for the ancestors. Far from being worshipped as gods, ancestors were honored as guides, guardians, and teachers who continued to play an active role in the lives of their descendants. Ancestral reverence created continuity between generations, ensuring that wisdom was never lost. It also reinforced morality. To dishonor one's community or break harmony with the land was to dishonor the ancestors themselves. This was not about fear, but about responsibility and belonging. Spiritual leaders, diviners, herbalists, priests, and priestesses were central to this sacred order. They were not sorcerers, as colonial propaganda later claimed, but custodians of knowledge. Diviners used systems such as the Yoruba Ifa, which involved complex interpretations of patterns and symbols to reveal guidance from higher realms. Herbalists mastered medicinal plants, providing cures long before modern pharmacology. Priests and priestesses maintained balance between the community and the spiritual forces of nature. Their roles were scientific, social, and spiritual all at once. These traditions varied across the continent, but they shared common threads. Among the Yoruba, Ifa divination offered a sophisticated philosophy of destiny and balance. In the Akan traditions of Ghana, rituals honored deities known as Awesome, mediators between humanity and the Supreme Creator. In Central and Southern Africa, spiritual dances and initiation rites guided individuals from childhood into adulthood, weaving personal growth into the fabric of communal life. And in Vodun practices of West Africa, sacred rituals connected practitioners to powerful spirits who represented natural forces, justice, and healing. Each of these traditions was a library of wisdom, carried in song, symbol, and story. Music and dance were not simply cultural expressions, they were spiritual technologies. The Yoruba Egungun festival, for example, uses masked dances to bring the ancestors back among the living, reminding communities of their spiritual lineage. Among the Zulu, healing dances are performed in rhythmic unison, calling on spiritual energy to restore health and balance to the sick. In West African drumming ceremonies, each beat was more than sound. It was communication with the unseen, a language of vibrations that aligned the physical and spiritual worlds. African spirituality also emphasized harmony with nature. Rivers, forests, mountains, and animals were not merely resources to exploit, they were sacred beings, each holding spiritual energy. The Shona people of Zimbabwe regarded certain forests as sacred, protected by spiritual guardians, where cutting trees or hunting was strictly forbidden. In Ghana, sacred groves were preserved as dwelling places of spirits, ensuring biodiversity and ecological balance long before environmental conservation became an academic discipline. Communities recognized that to exploit nature recklessly was to invite imbalance, both physically and spiritually. The essence of African spirituality lay in its holistic vision. It saw no division between sacred and secular, or science and spirit. Healing ceremonies doubled as communal gatherings. Rituals of harvest were also lessons in sustainable agriculture. Music, dance, and oral storytelling carried encoded wisdom, ensuring knowledge survived across generations, even without books or written texts. Every rhythm, proverb, and ritual was a teaching tool, shaping both the individual and the community. When we examine these foundations, it becomes clear that African spirituality was not a set of primitive superstitions. It was a highly organized, deeply philosophical, and profoundly human system of knowledge. It offered explanations for existence, methods for healing, structures for governance, and meaning for life itself. To call it Black Power was to simplify something vast, but it also revealed what outsiders recognized. It was a source of strength, resilience, and unbreakable identity. And this strength would later become the very reason it was targeted for destruction. The arrival of European colonizers and missionaries in Africa marked a turning point in the fate of African spirituality. What had been revered as sacred and life-giving was suddenly labeled as backward, evil, and dangerous. The demonization of African traditions was not an accident, but a deliberate campaign designed to break the backbone of societies and pave the way for conquest. The battlefield was not only on the soil of Africa, but also in the minds and souls of its people. Missionaries were often the first agents of this transformation. Armed not only with the Bible, but also with the ideological certainty that European ways were superior, they regarded African spirituality as a threat to conversion. Practices such as ancestor reverence, divination, and ritual healing were condemned as idolatry and devil worship. To justify their mission, they equated African deities and spirits with demons, reducing a sophisticated spiritual worldview into caricatures of evil. The goal was clear: replace African cosmologies with Christianity and reorient loyalty from ancestors and communities to the church and empire. Colonial governments supported this process with laws and violence. In Nigeria, British authorities passed ordinances that criminalized indigenous practices, branding them as witchcraft. Sacred groves were destroyed in the name of civilization. In South Africa, spiritual leaders such as diviners were hunted, imprisoned, and ridiculed. Across French West Africa, shrines were desecrated, and ceremonies were banned unless they served colonial order. In every case, the suppression of spirituality was tied directly to the control of land, labor, and resources. By cutting people off from their spiritual roots, colonizers weakened resistance to their rule. The demonization went beyond suppression. It was psychological warfare. Africans were told that their ancestors, once seen as protectors, were now cursed. Children were taught in mission schools that drums, masks, and rituals were symbols of evil. Families were pressured to abandon rituals and attend church, often under threat of punishment. The power of shame became a tool more effective than the gun. Slowly, generations grew up believing that what their forebears had practiced with pride was now something to be feared and hidden. One striking example is the story of the Yoruba people under British rule. The Ifa divination system, one of the most sophisticated bodies of spiritual knowledge in the world, was attacked as witchcraft. Priests who had guided communities for centuries were marginalized, their shrines desecrated. Yet, the irony is that many of these practices survived underground, hidden in households, or disguised under the cover of Christian symbolism. The more colonial powers tried to erase them, the more they adapted. In Central Africa, colonial campaigns were even more brutal. Belgian authorities in the Congo forced entire villages to abandon traditional rituals under threat of death or mutilation. Priests who resisted conversion were executed. Sacred masks and artifacts were stolen, shipped to European museums, and reframed as exotic curiosities rather than symbols of living traditions. The theft was not only of land and bodies, but also of meaning. Even language itself became a tool of demonization. Words that once meant healer or seer were retranslated into witch or sorcerer. Ritual specialists who worked with herbs and spirits to heal were suddenly recast as people who spread fear and harm. This shift in language reshaped perception. By controlling the narrative, colonizers made it easier to convince Africans that their own culture was inferior and dangerous. Yet, despite these efforts, African spirituality did not die. It endured in whispers, in secret rituals held at night, in proverbs passed from elders to children, in songs whose meanings were coded beneath the surface. Spirituality became both a hidden weapon and a quiet rebellion. To continue practicing was to resist. To honor the ancestors in secret was to reject the imposed shame. Though colonizers branded these traditions as black power in the sense of evil, Africans understood that this power was, in truth, their strength. By the end of the colonial period, millions of Africans had been converted to Christianity and Islam. But the spiritual foundations of the continent had not disappeared. They had gone underground, waiting for the day when they could resurface. What colonization could not fully destroy was the memory. The knowing that beneath the imposed religion lay something older, deeper, and unbreakable. When millions of Africans were torn from their homelands and forced onto slave ships, they did not leave their spirituality behind. Even in chains, they carried their sacred songs, their rituals, and their memory of ancestors. On plantations in the Americas and the Caribbean, African spirituality became both a lifeline and a weapon of resistance. It provided hope where despair was constant, and it kept alive a sense of identity in a world designed to erase it. But enslavers recognized this power and feared it. Just as colonizers in Africa had branded these traditions as evil, plantation owners in the Americas condemned them as dangerous and threatening. The fear was not superstition. It was political. They knew that rituals could unify the enslaved, give them courage, and inspire rebellion. So, spiritual practices were banned, and those caught performing them were often tortured or killed. The demonization of African spirituality intensified in the New World because it threatened the very foundation of slavery itself. Despite these restrictions, African traditions adapted and survived. In Haiti, Vodou emerged as a powerful spiritual system, blending African cosmologies with elements of Catholicism. In Cuba, enslaved Yoruba people gave rise to Santeria, hiding their deities, the Orishas, behind the names of Catholic saints. In Brazil, the traditions of Candomblé preserved the rhythms, chants, and rituals of West Africa, ensuring that enslaved people retained a spiritual language of freedom. These systems were more than religion. They were codes of survival, ways of protecting memory while navigating a brutal new world. The resilience of these practices is perhaps most evident in the Haitian Revolution. Enslaved Africans gathered at Bois Caiman in 1791 for a Vodou ceremony that would spark the greatest slave revolt in history. Through ritual, they affirmed unity, invoked their ancestors, and declared war on oppression. What Europeans dismissed as black power in the sense of darkness was in fact the light of liberation. Spirituality became the fuel for revolution, proving that these traditions carried political as well as sacred strength. The demonization, however, never ceased. In the Caribbean and the Americas, colonial powers and later governments painted voodoo, santeria, and candomblé as devil worship. Hollywood would later amplify these distortions, portraying practitioners as sinister sorcerers with dolls, curses, and zombies. While European mysticism was romanticized in literature and art, African spirituality was consistently framed as terrifying and evil. This narrative made it easier for societies to dismiss the wisdom of African-descended peoples while consuming their labor and culture. Yet for the enslaved and their descendants, spirituality never stopped being a shield. The drumbeat became a heartbeat of survival. Rituals honored ancestors who had endured the Middle Passage, reminding the living that their strength came from those who had resisted before them. Even when practiced in secret, these traditions gave dignity, identity, and power to communities forced to live in the shadow of oppression. Across the diaspora, African spirituality proved itself unbreakable. It reshaped itself, blended with new elements, and yet held on to its essence. It taught that no matter the chains, the body could be enslaved, but the spirit could never be fully captured. This unbroken thread connects the rituals of West Africa to the streets of Havana, the temples of Bahia, and the mountains of Haiti. What colonizers called black power to demonize was in truth the very power that fueled survival and freedom. If colonization and slavery planted the seeds of demonization, Hollywood and modern media watered them until they grew into global myths. For over a century, film, television, and literature have depicted African spirituality as something terrifying. What was once sacred ritual became, on screen, a spectacle of curses, dolls, and shadows. These distorted images shaped the global imagination, teaching millions to associate African traditions with fear rather than wisdom. From the earliest days of cinema, Hollywood found profit in exploiting the mystery of Africa. Films like White Zombie, 1932, introduced the idea of the zombie, not as it existed in Haitian voodoo, but as a monstrous creature stripped of spiritual meaning. The image of the witch doctor, often painted with exaggerated costumes and sinister laughter, became a stock character in adventure films. These portrayals bore no resemblance to real priests, priestesses, or healers. They were caricatures meant to entertain Western audiences at the expense of truth. The stereotype grew stronger with time. Cartoons, comic books, and later blockbuster films continued to recycle the trope of African spirituality as dangerous, chaotic, and evil. Voodoo dolls appeared in children's shows. Drums were portrayed as ominous signals of death rather than sacred instruments of healing and celebration. Even when films attempted to be serious, they often framed African traditions as obstacles to progress, something to be overcome by science, Christianity, or Western rationality. This double standard is striking when compared to how Western occult traditions are treated. European witchcraft is often romanticized in novels and films, portrayed as mystical, intriguing, or even empowering. Tarot cards, astrology, and Wicca are presented as harmless explorations of the spiritual. But when African traditions appear, they are rarely shown as empowering or healing. They are cast as threats. The same practices that were condemned in Africa were celebrated in Europe, once stripped of their African roots. The consequences of this narrative run deep. Generations of African descendants grew up internalizing fear of their own heritage. A child watching a film about zombies or voodoo curses might not realize they are seeing a distorted reflection of their ancestors' practices. Communities turned away from their traditions not just because of colonial and missionary influence, but also because global media repeated the same message: your spirituality is dangerous. In this way, Hollywood became a silent missionary, spreading fear instead of understanding. Yet beneath the distortion, truth still survives. Real voodoo ceremonies in Haiti are about healing, justice, and honoring ancestors. Santeria in Cuba celebrates life through drumming, dance, and ritual offerings. Candomblé in Brazil preserves songs and languages from West Africa, keeping alive a history that slavery tried to erase. These traditions have always been about connection, not destruction. What Hollywood called black power in order to stigmatize was, in reality, cultural memory disguised as threat. Today, a shift is beginning. Independent filmmakers, African storytellers, and scholars are reclaiming these narratives, showing audiences what was hidden behind the caricatures. Documentaries, novels, and digital platforms are peeling away the myths to reveal the beauty, depth, and humanity of African spirituality. The journey is far from over, but every honest portrayal pushes back against decades of demonization. The media may have turned sacred rites into horror tropes, but the truth remains unbroken. African spirituality is not a shadow hanging over the world, but a flame that refuses to be extinguished. The demonization of African spirituality was not only a matter of politics or religion, it was psychological warfare. Colonizers understood that to dominate a people physically, they first had to dominate them mentally. Fear became the sharpest weapon. By convincing Africans that their own traditions were dangerous, colonizers planted doubt where there had once been certainty. This was not simply about banning rituals, it was about reshaping the mind. The process began with shame. Africans were told that their ancestors, once honored as wise and protective, were instead cursed or demonic. Rituals that had guided communities for centuries were reframed as signs of backwardness. Children in mission schools learned that their parents' beliefs were wrong, even sinful. Generations began to internalize the idea that their own roots were poisonous. Shame created silence, and silence created disconnection. Fear was the next layer. By branding sacred practices as dark or evil, colonizers ensured that even those who secretly continued rituals would do so under constant anxiety. A healer who once worked proudly for the community might now practice in hiding, afraid of exposure. Families whispered their prayers instead of singing them. The fear of punishment was external at first, but soon it became internal. A voice inside telling people to reject themselves. This psychological attack had long-lasting effects. When you teach a people to fear their own identity, you weaken their unity. Communities that once drew strength from shared rituals now turned on each other, with some embracing the colonial narrative and others resisting it. Families were divided between those who converted and those who clung to tradition. The enemy no longer needed to be present in every village. The enemy was in the mind, replaying the colonizer's story as if it were truth. The double standard made this strategy even more powerful. European mysticism, alchemy, astrology, or witchcraft was framed as folklore or art, something to study, romanticize, or adapt. African spirituality, on the other hand, was framed as barbaric and dangerous. This hypocrisy reinforced the idea that African culture was inherently inferior, while European traditions could be celebrated. By creating this imbalance, colonizers ensured that Africans would aspire to foreign systems while distancing themselves from their own. And yet, the psychology of demonization could not fully succeed. Deep within communities, the memory of truth survived. The whisper of an elder, the rhythm of a drum, the quiet act of pouring libation, all of these resisted the narrative of fear. Despite centuries of conditioning, the human spirit clung to its roots. Demonization wounded identity, but it could not erase it. Instead, it left scars, reminders of the struggle, and seeds of the revival we see today. Despite centuries of suppression, African spirituality is experiencing a resurgence. Across the continent and throughout the diaspora, people are reclaiming practices once labeled as dangerous and shameful. What was forced underground is now re-emerging in the open, not as relics of the past, but as living traditions with meaning for the present. Reclamation is not about nostalgia. It is about survival, healing, and truth. One of the most powerful aspects of this revival is the work of reconnection. Young Africans and members of the diaspora are seeking out traditional healers, studying ancestral rituals, and relearning the wisdom that colonial narratives tried to erase. In places like Nigeria, Ghana, and South Africa, ceremonies once hidden are now performed openly, drawing both local communities and curious visitors who want to understand. This is not only a cultural shift, but also a spiritual reawakening. Academia and scholarship have also played a role in this revival. Anthropologists, historians, and African scholars are publishing research that challenges stereotypes, documenting traditions with respect, and preserving oral histories. Online platforms have amplified this work, giving a voice to spiritual leaders and practitioners who can now share their knowledge beyond their immediate communities. Social media has become a global classroom where people can learn about Ifa, Voodoo, Santeria, or Candomblé without the filter of colonial prejudice. Reclamation is also personal. Many individuals are turning to ancestral practices as a form of healing. In societies still struggling with the wounds of slavery, racism, and colonization, African spirituality offers a framework for mental, emotional, and communal restoration. Rituals of honoring ancestors, for example, restore a sense of belonging in a world that often feels disconnected. The use of herbs, music, and storytelling provides not just spiritual comfort but also cultural pride. To reclaim these practices is to affirm we are more than the narratives imposed on us. The revival has even entered popular culture. Musicians, artists, and writers are weaving traditional symbols, proverbs, and cosmologies into their work, reclaiming space in the global imagination. Where Hollywood once painted voodoo as horror, today African filmmakers and creators are telling their own stories, reframing these traditions as sources of beauty and resilience. Every song, film, or painting that honors these roots pushes back against centuries of misrepresentation. Reclamation is not without its challenges. Some fear that commercialization may dilute sacred practices, while others worry about blending traditions with modern life. Yet, these debates show something vital. African spirituality is alive. It is not frozen in history or confined to museums. It continues to grow, adapt, and inspire. And in this growth, it reclaims its rightful place as a source of wisdom and empowerment. What was once branded as Black power, in order to stigmatize, is now being recognized as true power, the power of continuity, resilience, and cultural survival. Reclamation is not simply about honoring ancestors. It is about ensuring that their strength carries forward into future generations. African spirituality has traveled a long, painful road, from being the sacred heartbeat of civilizations to being branded as Black power in the most sinister sense. Colonization, slavery, and media rewrote its meaning, turning wisdom into superstition, healers into villains, and rituals into shadows. This was not by chance. Demonization was a deliberate strategy to weaken identity, fracture communities, and control entire nations. But despite centuries of attack, these traditions endured. We've seen how spirituality once grounded every aspect of African life, guiding politics, medicine, art, and community. We've traced how colonizers used shame and fear to dismantle those systems, how enslaved Africans carried them across oceans, and how Hollywood later cemented false images that still linger today. Yet we've also seen the other side of the story, the resilience of a people who refused to let their soul be erased. Every whispered prayer, every coded drumbeat, every secret ritual was an act of defiance, a declaration that truth cannot be killed. The demonization of African spirituality tells us less about the traditions themselves and more about the power they held. Systems that connect people to ancestors, to nature, and to one another are not weak, they are unbreakable. That is why empires tried so hard to destroy them. What was framed as Black power to instill fear was, in truth, the kind of power that liberates, heals, and unites. Today we stand at a crossroads. The revival of African spirituality shows that history cannot bury truth forever. Scholars, artists, practitioners, and communities are breathing life into traditions that once had to hide. In their revival, there is not only healing for individuals, but also restoration for entire cultures. To reclaim these practices is to reclaim dignity, pride, and connection to something greater than ourselves. So as we close, remember this: African spirituality is not a shadow of the past. It is a living fire, carried through centuries of resistance, now blazing again with purpose. To honor it is not to look backward, but to move forward with deeper roots. If this journey has opened your eyes or sparked reflection, join the conversation. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories that challenge the myths and celebrate the truth. Because reclaiming this knowledge is not just history, it is liberation.